Hi, in this one, we're going to start to delve into the world of exponents. So, there's nothing complicated with exponents. All it is repeated multiplication. Okay. In other words, you're just multiplying the same thing over and over and over again. So, if you were given something like 5 to the first power, that means you just have a 5. Okay. If you had something like 3 to the first power, same thing. You just have a 3. Okay, you're really not multiplying anything by itself. 5 to the second power is 5 multiplied by itself twice. Okay, so this is going to be 5 times 5. Another way we express this is that we say that this is squared. 5 squared. Okay, we also say that it's a power. So another way of saying 5 squared is 5 raised to the power of 2. Okay, so there's a couple ways of saying this in different ways. So you could say it's 5 squared, 5 raised to the power of 2. And you could also say that it's 5 with an exponent of 2. Okay, all of them mean the same thing. It's just multiplying 5 by itself twice. Okay, so this is cubed. Another way of saying 5 to the third power is saying that that number is being cubed. Okay, so 5 cubed, 5 raised to the power of 3, 5 with an exponent of 3. All mean the same thing. 5 multiplied by itself 3 times. By the way, anything raised to the power of 0 is 1. Okay, so any number, so 2 raised to the power of 0 is 1. 1,000 raised to the power of 0 is 1. Okay, something you just need to have remembered. The other thing you need to know is the structure of exponential expressions. So in algebra, we call this the base. Okay, the number that you raise something to is called the base. Okay, the smaller number, in other words, the exponent, is called the exponent. Okay, so given an expression like this, so like 3 to the power of 5, the base is 3 and the exponent is 5. And these numbers, so if I have 5 raised to the power of 5, that is 5 times 5 times 5 times 5 times 5. Well, this thing here, these are called factors. Okay. In other words, they multiply together to give you 5 raised to the power of 5. Okay. Let's go over an example. It says write an exponential form. Okay. This is what we just went over. Since there's 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, this is going to equal a base of 3 raised to the power of 4. Okay. So this is the exponential form of that. Let's go over another one. So here we have x times x times x times x times x times x. There's 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Therefore, in exponential form, that is going to be x raised to the power of 6. C. So we have negative 5 times x times y times 7 times x times y times x. All you have to do is count up the x's and y's. The real numbers here that you're multiplying, or the integers, you can just multiply them together. So negative 5 times 7 is what? It's negative 35. And for the x variable, how many are there? 1, 2, and 3. So that's going to get an exponent of 3. And for the y variable, there's 2 of them. So that's going to get an exponent of 2. Therefore, the answer is negative 35, x to the third power, y to the second power, or x cubed and y squared. Now, one thing you need to be careful is expressions that involve parentheses with exponents. So something like 9a squared is not, okay, equal to 9a inside of parentheses squared, okay? This thing is only squaring the a. In other words, the exponent is only applied to the a, okay, whatever a is. This thing, the square, the exponent of 2, is getting applied to the 9 and is getting applied to the a. So rewritten, it would be 9 squared and a squared, which is the same thing as 81, right? 9 times 9. It's the same thing as 81a squared, okay? So there's a difference between that and that. Okay, so let's try an example. It says evaluate for x equals -5. Anytime you run into the word evaluate in a math problem, it's telling you to basically plug in for the unknown value and then simplify. So what this is saying is you have a -5. -5 is x, okay? And then it's telling you to cube it. Okay, so what you're going to do is surround the thing with parentheses. Since the whole thing of -5 is equal to x, you're going to surround it with parentheses and raise that to the third power. And remember that 3 is getting applied to negative and it's getting applied to the 5. So what happens to the negative when you raise it to a power of 3? Well, negative times a negative times a negative is going to give you a negative. Okay, anytime you have a negative raised to an odd power, you're going to get a negative. A negative raised to an even power, so like negative times a negative, or negative times negative, 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 negative raised to the fourth power. Anytime you get a negative raised to an even power, you're going to get a positive. Okay, so since this is odd, okay, 3 is odd, you're going to end up with a negative answer. So you can write a negative there, and then just do 5 cubed. So 5 times 5 times 5, which is 125. That's going to be your answer. So this is very different from this example. So what you can see is that there is no parentheses. In other words, what we have here is -5 cubed, but the cube, or the power of 3, is only getting applied to the 5. It is not getting applied to negative, okay? But what happens is the answer is the same, okay? So you have a negative there and a negative there. So 5 cubed is the same thing, 125 as before, okay? Let's say you had something like, so -2, sorry, -5 raised to the second power. So the 2 would apply to the negative and it would apply to 5. A negative times a negative is positive, so the negative would go away, and 5 squared would be 25. This is different from that. Okay, that's the point I was trying to make. So an exponent of 2 here does not apply to the negative. So in this case, what you would have is negative and then 5 squared, which is 25, which would give you a -25. Okay, it's very important to know the difference between these two problems.